Revered by millions, known as the People's Pope, Pope Francis died after suffering a stroke and heart failure. His 12-year papacy was defined by firsts as he leaves behind a legacy of compassion and humility.
From the moment he addressed a 150,000-strong crowd at St. Peter's Square on March 13, 2013, Bishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina, now Pope Francis, was a symbol for change in the Catholic Church.
Vi lascio grazie tante dell'accoglienza. Pregate per me.
A disruptor from the outset, he was the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere and the first non-European pontiff in more than 1,000 years.
He was a humble, simple person who had great love for people and for the poor, and so exemplified the teachings and life of Jesus in a really clear way that resonated with people all around the world.
He, without a doubt, was the most inclusive Pope I think we've ever had.
I think he was wonderful.
He supported everyone at all levels and stood up for peace.
From early in his papacy, Francis was a protector of the poor, the marginalised and the oppressed, calling on Catholics to love the LGBTQIA+ community, speaking out against laws that target them.
Questo non è giusto. Le persone di tendenze omosessuali sono figli di Dio.
The pontiff condemned Israel's invasion of Gaza and prayed for peace in Ukraine the day before he died.
Cristo risorto e fonda il dono pasquale della pace sulla martoriata Ucraina.
A strong and vocal environmental advocate, Pope Francis used his papacy to make climate change front and centre.
Climate change is a problem we can no longer be left to a future generation.
But he wasn't immune from criticism.
Some of the areas that Pope Francis was criticised for was his respect or promotion of women's place in the church, his handling of some sexual abuse matters, and also his engagement with gay and lesbian couples and the blessings of their marriages.
As the world farewells the People's Pope, Francis's legacy is present in the millions now gathering in churches around the globe.
He was not only a pope for the religious people, also for the non-believers. He was important.
We're joined now by the Archbishop of Melbourne, Peter Comensoli. Thank you very much for joining us, Archbishop, and condolences at a time like this. Clearly very sad time for a lot of Catholics. Everyone's reflecting on the legacy of the late Pope. What are your reflections?
I keep going back to images of him in gestures. Different popes have been brought different gifts. The way in which Francis engaged with people was by gestures. We just were seeing a number of those, how he would kiss the feet of prisoners. He would embrace those people that others would just shy away from. I remember quite distinctly a few years ago when he got down on his hands and knees. This is an old man. Down on his hands and knees, kissing the feet of the two leaders in the civil war in Sudan as a gesture towards seeking their reconciliation. So a man of gestures in so many different ways.
Well, hundreds of years from now, how do you think that people will look back and see his papacy? Like, what will they think about it? They'll be there and they think, oh, OK, Pope Francis, he is this.
I think those elements of him being a true shepherd, you know, it's a funny expression we use in our Catholic tradition, talking about a leader as a shepherd, but as a way of guiding people. He was very much that. And so that element of his, I think, will stay. Lots of popes come and go. That's been always the tradition. But their legacies are all different. He, as a shepherd, as a pastor, I think will be something that people will look back in, decades and centuries.
The first Latin American Pope from Argentina, a proud San Lorenzo football supporter in Buenos Aires. How did him, I guess, being non-European or coming from South America in particular, kind of shape the church?
Firstly, isn't it great that we had a Pope from the South? I think that's just tremendous. So thanks to the Cardinals last time around for giving us someone from the South. I think it has indeed shaped the whole of the church because he had been shaped. The history of Argentina would be well known. He lived through great difficulties, through the junta, through Peronism at times, the upheavals, and being able to bring the gift of the faith and the name of Jesus into those circumstances certainly shaped him, such that it would shape us. Can I give one example in that regard?
Yeah, please do.
You'd be, I hope, aware of just how extraordinary his outreach to migrants and refugees was. A defining feature of his papacy has been a call to everyone to welcome, to engage with, embrace and integrate migrants and refugees. He went, thinking back into, I think, around 2015, him going off to Lampedusa, the island where so many from North Africa were coming, drowning in the Mediterranean, being rejected by many countries within Europe at that time. He goes to there and says, we need to be with these people and find a way.
Amazing.
You know, as extraordinarily humble as he was not without his criticism, which we heard in the story. Was that fair?
I can't think of a pope that doesn't have both sides. Every pope has brought something of a gift, but always bringing gifts can be received differently. So I'm not bothered by that there might have been some aspects of his papacy that people questioned and wondered about. That's not an issue, I don't think, really. That he was leading a way is what's important here. And his gift of speaking the name of Jesus Christ into the world and seeing that as a way of living towards hope, towards mercy, these really deep things that are needed within our society. If that generates criticism, well, so be it.
Archbishop, we really appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts with us. We know that you were in mourning, as is your congregation, so we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, there's been a global outpouring of tributes for Pope Francis. They're continuing as more than 1 billion Catholics remember a life that moved so many.
The world in mourning as millions reflect on the life of the people's Pope, Pope Francis.
It was because of Pope Francis that I came back to embrace my faith.
We should emulate him. He was a man who had a heart for the weak and the poor.
World leaders paying tribute to a man who was never afraid to stand his ground.
He was a good man, worked hard. He loved the world.
The Pope has done a lot not only for his flock, but for the world in general.
Alongside the grief for the death of Pope Francis, I feel a sense of emptiness.
I wanted to express here all the sadness we feel at this time and the great pain shared by many in France.
It is a painful loss. May he rest in peace.
In the Pope's native South America, leaders from across the political spectrum with a rare show of unity. And here at home, a mark of respect as party leaders suspend campaigning.
Today, the prayers of more than 1 billion people from all nations and every walk of life go with Pope Francis to his rest.
This is a moment of mourning, but it's also a moment of celebration of a life that was one of sacrifice, of mercy and of forbearance.
the faithful gathering for memorial mass across Australia.
You seen him on Sunday and then you see him, he's gone the next day, like, you know, it's just... But anyways, it's a good man gone, you know.
So loving, so loving. Yeah, I will really miss him.
The Pope's passing has triggered a 9-day period of mourning, with the funeral expected in between 4 and 6 days' time. At the Pope's request, the funeral process will be stripped back. His final resting place, a simple, unadorned tomb at his favourite church in Rome, rather than the vast St. Peter's Basilica.
He didn't want it to be a funeral for a monarch or a great important man in the world. He wanted it to be for a pastor.
But tonight, an outpouring of emotion as millions remember the life of the great Pope Francis.
He has accomplished his mission in this world, in this earth, and now he's with God.
Well, Claire Giangrave is a Vatican correspondent with the Religion News Service. She spent 13 years covering the Pope. Claire, it's such an emotional time for so many across the world. As someone who's worked closely alongside Pope Francis for so long, how are you feeling at the moment?
It's definitely been beyond the journalistic experience of having covered this man and his powerful legacy, also a personally very moving time. I can think back of certain moments where I was surprised by Pope Francis's very human behavior. One comes to mind when he had just gotten out of the hospital to be treated for several of the issues that were troubling him with his knee. And he saw a woman who walked up to him, and she had just lost her child. And the way he embraced her, I think I will really never forget that moment. And there are moments like that that just don't resonate with me, but with so many others. When he, knelt down to kiss the feet of inmates or warring parties in South Sudan.
Oh, we seem to be...
His papal clothing would sweep over his face, or his zucchetto would fly away.
What was it like, Claire, to work with the Pope?
Well, it was difficult because he was a man who loved surprises. And, the Vatican is a place that has a lot of rituals and standard ways of doing things. And he would often keep us all on our feet, just trying to figure out what is he going to do next time. So if, just think about the last few days where he would just be seen strolling through St. Peter's Basilica, just wearing a poncho and saying hello to kids and faithful, or amazing believers in the square to say one last goodbye, we now know, to faithful on Easter Sunday. I mean, it was just always keeping us guessing, always keeping us on our toes, not just from a practical standpoint, but I think he wanted to do that spiritually as well.
Claire, you would have spent so much time with him and seen him interact with so many people. Were there ever moments where you saw through the Pope and saw the man behind the papacy? And if so, what was it that you saw?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think most people, when they meet the Pope, and I would agree with that, is the smiling attitude. He's one of the most important people in the world, but he would look at you as if you were the only person there. That would happen to me when I would ask him questions, when I would greet him, and I was startled by that on several occasions. But people forget that this pastoral, welcoming, open Pope was also a reformer. This part of his legacy has so far not been discussed so much, but that means that he walked in, he changed up things happened in the Vatican and made some enemies along the way. So yes, sometimes I would see that sterner, tougher Pope who would have to keep people in line, and I was startled by that as well.
Wow, what a legacy he leaves. And Claire, what memories that you have of him too. What a position. Thank you so much for sharing him with us. Morning begins, all eyes are turning to who will become the next Pope. It's a process that's shrouded in secrecy and unchanged for 800 years. It begins now.
Tonight, cardinals from around the world are travelling to Rome for Pope Francis's 9-day funeral rites and to begin the closed-door meetings that will determine the future of the papacy.
They discuss the problems of the Church, what the financial situation is, and what are the qualities of a pontiff that are needed to bring the Church forward. At a certain point, they stop those meetings and the conclave begins.
It's a ritual first undertaken in the 11th century the process of which would be familiar to anyone who saw last year's timely Oscar-winning film, Conclave.
This is a conclave, Aldo. It's not a war.
It is a war.
The film Conclave was incredibly accurate, I think, in what actually happens in the chapels. When all those cardinals get there, there's three big things that they'll have to take into that conclave. How are we going to get a leader who will help us be more faithful, more hopeful, and more loving?
During the process, cardinals stay within Vatican City, all contact with the outside world cut off, as they cast their first votes to select the next pope. If no decision is reached, the ballots are burned.
The smoke comes out of the Sistine Chapel chimney. If it's black, it means no pope has been elected.
Multiple votes are held for as long as it takes to reach a decision. A two-third majority is required, and rules forbid anyone over the age of 80 from voting, which means the 136 cardinals currently under 80 will select the new pontiff. The youngest of the College of Cardinals is 45-year-old Bishop Mykola Bajchok from Melbourne, who was made cardinal by Francis just 4 months ago and is now among those choosing his successor.
It could be that they elect somebody who is much more traditional than Pope Francis was, but it would be very difficult for that person to unwrap all the changes that Francis has made in the last 13 years.
Vatican watchers believe the frontrunners include Italy's Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State, and Matteo Zuppi, lauded for his diplomatic experience, as well as Filipino Cardinal Luis Tagle, called the Asian Francis due to his commitment to social justice, and Hungary's Peter Erdo, believed to be the favourite among the Conservative wing. When the candidate is finally chosen, white smoke will emerge from the Sistine Chapel, alerting the world that a decision has been made, and a cardinal will emerge to deliver these words.
Habemus Papa.
Dr. Miles Pattenden is a Catholic Church historian who joins us now. Dr. Miles, why is this such a secretive process?
Well, it's so secretive partly because of the theory behind it, that nobody wants to think that the Pope is chosen by a bunch of middle-aged or elderly men advancing their own agendas of different kinds. The theology of the papal election is that the Holy Spirit descends on the cardinals and inspires their choice. Well, obviously, it's much easier to sustain that idea if the cardinals are isolated in a room like the Sistine Chapel where no one can see what they're saying to each other and nobody knows exactly how they voted or who voted for whom. And so the practice of the papal election has emerged over several centuries to sustain that theological idea that the Pope is God's choice, not the choice of a bunch of men.
Dr. Miles, a lot of people would be thinking of the film Conclave at the moment. Timing is such a mysterious thing, and I have to admit that I'm one of them. Just how accurate do you think that it is?
Well, I saw that film too, and I thought it was rather fantastic. But it's most accurate in terms of its representation of the process and the visuals, I think, of what goes on. I wasn't so convinced by the characterization of some of the cardinals and the slightly overtly political way in which they talk to each other. But of course, we also see that with senior politicians. They don't speak to each other in real life like they do in drama. So I think we look for the same kind of gap between the film and the reality that will occur over the next few weeks.
I hope the real life of the cardinals is different from the real life of politicians, but I'll leave that as an aside for the moment. In this particular case, Pope Francis was considered, to use the crude political terminology that we see, a fairly progressive choice. He, of course, chose many of the cardinals who will now be deliberating on this. Does that mean that a pope that walks in his footsteps is more likely now, or do you think the Church might go back the other way?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think it's probably on balance more likely that we see somebody who is broadly speaking in Francis's mould. But of course, famously, there's the Italian proverb, after a fat pope, a thin one. And that's certainly what we saw in 2013. Pope Benedict XVI, widely known to have been pretty conservative in most of his views, and Francis, of course, rather different to that. That said, we also know that Francis has appointed 80% of the cardinals that are going to vote in the conclave for his successor, which would lead you to think, well, at least a large proportion of those are going to be reasonably ideologically aligned to him. On the other hand, another way of saying 80% of the cardinals were selected by Francis is that 80% of the cardinals have never taken part in another papal conclave. So we just don't know how it's going to work out.
Do you think we could ever see an Australian pope?
Well, I would think that's very unlikely, partly because the only Australian cardinal within the college, if you count him as an Australian cardinal, is 45.
Yes.
But historically, and I think it still holds, that most of the cardinals don't really want a pope from the Anglosphere. They think that English and American culture is already much too dominant. So it's very unlikely to see a pope drawn from Australia or the United Kingdom or America.
You're really narrowing it down,
Well,
Doc.
actually, on that point, though, what about Africa? Because there's never been an African pope, I understand. The centre of gravity of the laity, at least, seems to be moving in that direction. It's a huge African religion. Can you see a world in which, I know there's a Ghanaian candidate, for example, where he might be selected?
Well, an African pope is certainly a very lively possibility, and that could happen. The thing which counts against some of the leading African candidates is that they are generally a great deal more conservative than the average or the median cardinal, and that means they might struggle to form the two-thirds majority that's required to get over the line in this election. It's much more likely that they'll have a say in blocking one of the more progressive European candidates, and we'll see some kind of compromise figure emerge through the middle who's a little bit progressive but moderate enough that conservatives in the church are satisfied. But again, we just don't know, because that's not the only axis on which the cardinals think. It's not just about ideology, it's also about charisma, pastoral appeal, and frankly, the ability to govern the church itself.
Pope with Riz. Dr. Pattenden, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.